So there are new sexual assault allegations coming out about Vin Diesel from something that happened over a decade ago. And just like what we're seeing with New York, where the statute of limitations was temporarily lifted so victims could come forward, we're seeing this case brought forward against Vin Diesel in California under California's Sexual Abuse and Cover-Up Accountability Act. And you may have already seen this story, but Vin Diesel has responded already, and we also have a full case filing provided by Deadline. So if you've seen me do one of these case filing readings before, what I do is I do a top-level summary of what we know so far, and then I do a full reading. I'll also link to everything in the description, so that way you can read it on your own if you don't want to listen to my voice. And this is going to be a blind read for me, as it usually is. I might point out things I think are interesting as I go along or recap them at the end. And I currently have no position one way or the other. If I happen to form an opinion as I go, which I expect if I do, it'll ebb and flow, right? As I find out new information. You don't need to agree with me. Your thoughts and your reactions are entirely yours to have. And while I'm primarily interested in cases that involve exonerations, high-profile long sentences, multiple life sentences, and exonerations that come from we find DNA evidence was wrong or was never used and it exonerates someone, or there was perjury or false accusations involved, or bad witness testimony, bad expert witness testimony, false confessions. That's really where my interest lies as far as who I'd like to advocate for. So sometimes when I do stuff like this, it's more because I think the social reactions are very interesting. Because in a case like this, it does involve, a familiar face, a familiar name, someone that people joke is family, right? But just as a reminder that even though I covered the Jonathan Majors case, where I came to my own conclusion that he was falsely accused and falsely charged of the things he was charged with, I'm not standing on any opinion about this Vin Diesel case. I'm just interested in seeing what the filing says. So with that being said, let's read the summary and let's jump in. A former assistant to Vin Diesel has accused the actor of sexually molesting her in Atlanta during the filming of Fast 5 in 2010, and then firing her in retaliation soon afterward. The suit, filed on Thursday in Los Angeles Superior Court, alleges that Vin Diesel attacked Asta Jonasson? Let's say Asta Jonasson, in the St. Regis Hotel after a night of seemingly hard partying with hostesses he'd met at a nearby club. And now this is a quote. Vin Diesel forcibly grabbed Miss Jonasson, groped her breasts, and kissed her, says the 10-claim sexual battery, discrimination, and retaliation complaint. Miss Jonasson struggled continually to break free of his grasp while repeatedly saying no. Vin Diesel is physically larger and much stronger than Miss Jonasson, and abused his position of authority as her employer and was able to easily overpower Miss Jonasson. Now we're going to see in this filing, because I've seen the first page opening it up to make sure it was the full filing, it's going to be against Vin Diesel, his sister, and his business entities. So this isn't just a filing that's going after Vin Diesel, it's also holding his companies and anyone that could have been considered as in an employment relationship with Asta Jonasson as part of this filing, all grouped together as co-defendants. And it's not just sexual abuse that's being alleged, sexual assault that's being alleged, it's also, all the workplace violations. So discrimination and retaliation are going to come into play in this suit. A recent example of that was Cassie's filing against Diddy, where it wasn't just alleging that in the course of their relationship, Diddy did XYZ that was sexually, physically, and emotionally abusive, but also that as being in a position of an employer to Cassie, all these other workplace-related violations came into play as well. So, Vin Diesel ignored Miss Jonasson's clear statements of non-consent to his sexual assaults. The filing by lawyers from Greenberg Gross adds detail. Vin Diesel then escalated his assault, groped her body, dropped to his knees, and pushed Miss Jonasson's dress up, groped her legs, and attempted to pull down Miss Jonasson's underwear. Terrified for her personal safety, Miss Jonasson screamed and ran to the nearby bathroom. Filed under California's Sexual Abuse Cover-Up Accountability Act, which is important because that's why they're able to file this even though it happened in 2010. That lifted statutes of limitations. Jonasson's suit goes on to graphically detail how Diesel supposedly pinned her against the wall with his body and grabbed Miss Jonasson's hand and placed it on his erect penis. The Guardians of the Galaxy actor then masturbated as he held Jonasson against the hotel wall, she alleges. Miss Jonasson was unable to escape and closed her eyes, scared of angering Vin Diesel by rejecting him further and trying to dissociate, wishing the assault would end. Miss Jonasson then heard groaning noises from Vin Diesel, and he quickly released Miss Jonasson and went to the bathroom and turned on the sink. Jonasson was frozen in a state of shock and unable to move. Vin Diesel then walked past Miss Jonasson and said, "No one can say shit about Asta," as he left the room. A few hours later, still at the hotel and still processing the immediate aftermath of Vin Diesel's sexual assault, Jonasson claimed she got a call from Samantha Vincent, the actor's sister, and head of his One Race production company. Vincent stated that One Race no longer needed any extra help and terminated Miss Jonasson's employment after just days on the job. The message was clear, today's suit declares. Miss Jonasson was fired for courageously resisting Vin Diesel's sexual assault. Vin Diesel would be protected and his sexual assault covered up. Miss Jonasson felt helpless, her self-esteem was demolished, and she questioned her own skills and whether a successful career would require her to trade her body for advancement. Film school grad Jonasson also said she was propositioned by another One Race employee before the incident with Diesel. Clearly, with the 10-picture Fast and Furious franchise having brought in more than $7 billion for Universal since its 2001 debut through the year's Fast X, there are lucrative stakes at play here for Diesel and the series. Although no specific figures cited in the jury trial seeking complete, Jonasson is pursuing a variety of damages against Diesel, Vincent, and One Race. And when they say Diesel, Vincent, and One Race, they mean Vin Diesel, his sister, and One Race. Among those are punitive and exemplary damages in an amount sufficient to punish defendants and make an example of and deter defendants from engaging in such conduct in the future. And now this is a quote from Brian Friedman, Vin Diesel's attorney. "Let me be very clear. Vin Diesel categorically denies this claim in its entirety. This is the first he has ever heard about this more than 13-year-old claim made by a purportedly 9-day employee. There is clear evidence which completely refutes these outlandish allegations." Now, if the name Brian Friedman sounds familiar, it's because he's represented a lot of familiar names. He represented Gabrielle Union in what ended up being a settlement with America's Got Talent. He represented the Michael Jackson estate in their $100 million lawsuit against the HBO Leaving Neverland documentary, and helped settle the dispute over the $500 million in the estate itself. And he's represented others from Seth Rogen to Quentin Tarantino to Robert Downey Jr. A lot of names. Now let's get into the reading. So there is going to be a watermark. Sorry for that. We'll read over it. And right here you can see that the defendants here, and remember this is a civil suit. It's probably a good time to remind everyone this is a civil suit, not a criminal suit, which means it's Asta Jonasson herself and her attorneys bringing this suit forward, not the people, not the state of California. And here you can see listed as co-defendants are not just Vin Diesel and Samantha Vincent, his sister, as individuals, but One Race Productions Incorporated, One Race Films Incorporated, and then Does 1 through 20. That's going to be a catch-all to, any ancillary companies that may be tied to this employment relationship being alleged for this 9 days of employment. They're leaving those does open to figure those out during discovery and name them as co-defendants. They're demanding a jury trial. And you can see here, there's 10 complaints for damages. One is sexual battery. Another is intentional infliction of emotional distress, which you could say could be related to the sexual battery or any of the other 8 complaints for damages. But the other 8 are related to employment, supervision, retaliation, labor, discrimination, harassment, hostile work environment. And then Asta is listed as living in Los Angeles, so it makes sense that it's coming forward in a Los Angeles court. And she lists her skills with 10 years experience as an executive assistant to C-suite principal skills, including scheduling, administrative tasks, development, TV film production duties on set, and post-production. She lists the Walt Disney Company as her full-time employer for 10 years and 6 months up until June 2022, and has been freelancing in film production full-time from July 2022 till the present. So she started with Disney as an executive assistant in January 2012. And has been freelancing for about a year and a half. So let's get to the suit. They're going to give us a ton of background, so it makes sense why it's in California. We know that she was employed with good tenure for 10 years through Disney. Even though her employment with Vin Diesel's company was only 9 days, she was able to retain her job for 10 years with Disney. But she also left Disney a year and a half ago and has been freelancing ever since, without much information provided about the success of that freelancing. And if we hop over to IMDb, this is some of the stuff that she's worked on as additional crew, so executive assistant to somebody, maybe even to the whole set. And 5 Days at Memorial says 2022. She's listed as the assistant to the producer for 8 episodes, all 8. Now, these episodes already aired starting August 12th for episode 1 and completed airing by September 16th, 2022. And if we do a quick search, casting began in March until August 2021, and production finally took place from May to November 2021 in New Orleans and Toronto. So this was likely while she was still employed through Disney. Unless, of course, she'd started doing freelance work and just didn't list the brackets correctly on LinkedIn. So let's read this suit. Plaintiff Asta Jonasson, plaintiff or Miss Jonasson, brings this action against defendants Vin Diesel, formerly known as Mark Sinclair Vincent, Vin Diesel, Samantha Vincent, Vincent, One Race Productions Inc., One Race Films Inc., with One Race Productions Inc., One Race, and Does 1 through 20, collectively defendants, and alleges as follows. Nature of the action. Miss Jonasson is a dedicated TV and film professional who has worked in the film industry for over a decade. In September 2010, Miss Jonasson was hired by One Race as an assistant working directly for Vin Diesel. Her first assignment was to immediately travel to the location for the filming of Fast 5, the 5th movie in the Fast and Furious film franchise. Miss Jonasson quickly got to work, organizing parties and catering to Vin Diesel's demands, including staying in close physical proximity to Vin Diesel when he was at parties without his long-term girlfriend, with whom he had children because, as he explained, it would provide him with cover if he was photographed with another woman. One night, Miss Jonasson was dutifully fulfilling her work duties, including ensuring no photographs were taken of Vin Diesel, who was entertaining multiple women in the Empire Suite of his luxury hotel. Although Vin Diesel had personal security, only Miss Jonasson remained in the hotel suite so the women felt more comfortable. After the last woman left in the early hours of the morning, Miss Jonasson was tasked with ushering Vin Diesel out of the hotel before dawn to avoid him being photographed and the paparazzi being alerted of his whereabouts. Alone in the hotel suite with him, Vin Diesel sexually assaulted Miss Jonasson. Vin Diesel forcibly grabbed Miss Jonasson, groped her breasts, and kissed her. Miss Jonasson struggled continually to break free of his grasp, while repeatedly saying no. Vin Diesel is physically larger and much stronger than Miss Jonasson, and abused his position of authority as her employer and was able to easily overpower Miss Jonasson. Vin Diesel ignored Miss Jonasson's clear statement of non-consent to his sexual assaults. Vin Diesel then escalated his assault, groped her body, dropped to his knees, and pushed Miss Jonasson's dress up, groped her legs, and attempted to pull down Miss Jonasson's underwear. Terrified for her personal safety, Miss Jonasson screamed and ran toward the nearby bathroom. Vin Diesel followed Miss Jonasson, pinned her against the wall with his body, and grabbed Miss Jonasson's hand and placed it on his erect penis. Disgusted by being forced to touch his penis, Miss Jonasson instantaneously withdrew her hand and again verbally refused him. Vin Diesel again ignored Miss Jonasson's pleas and instead pulled his penis out of his underwear and began to masturbate, while leaning against Miss Jonasson and keeping her pinned to the wall with the left side of his body. Miss Jonasson was unable to escape and closed her eyes, scared of angering Vin Diesel by rejecting him further and trying to dissociate, wishing the assault would end. Miss Jonasson then heard groaning noises from Vin Diesel, and he quickly released Miss Jonasson and went to the bathroom and turned on the sink. Jonasson was frozen in a state of shock and unable to move. Vin Diesel then walked past Miss Jonasson and said, "No one can say shit about Asta," as he left the room. Miss Jonasson remained in the hotel suite, shocked and seeking to avoid further interactions with Vin Diesel. As she stood alone in the suite, Miss Jonasson suddenly felt a mix of relief that the sexual assault was over and panic, and her heart felt like it was about to explode out of her chest. Unexpectedly, Vin Diesel returned and Miss Jonasson felt instantaneous terror. Vin Diesel asked for his phone, and Miss Jonasson managed to respond that the phone was in his pocket. Vin Diesel responded, "Good job," and finally exited the hotel suite. Mere hours later, as Miss Jonasson was still processing the immediate aftermath of Vin Diesel's sexual assault, Samantha Vincent, president of One Race and Vin Diesel's sister, called Miss Jonasson. Rather than take any actions to protect Miss Jonasson from further sexual assaults or punish Vin Diesel for his egregious actions, Vincent stated that One Race no longer needed any extra help and terminated Miss Jonasson's employment. The message was clear. Miss Jonasson was fired for courageously resisting Vin Diesel's sexual assault. Vin Diesel would be protected and his sexual assault covered up. Now, I'm going to pause there for two reasons. One, if we were to stop here, we're a page and a half into the text of the complaint, and we've basically, it's an exact copy of what we saw in the news articles, right? They wanted to cover these details. And secondly, I do want to point out that it jumps here that, Samantha Vincent calls Miss Jonasson, rather than take any actions to protect Miss Jonasson from further sexual assaults or punish Vin Diesel for his egregious actions. Samantha Vincent states that One Race no longer needs any extra help and terminates Miss Jonasson's employment. The message was clear, that that's why she was fired. So it's actually not clear here if Samantha Vincent is clear on the reason for termination for Asta Jonasson. we kind of skip that, right? We kind of we have this quote here, we don't need any extra help, but there's no quote, there's nothing, at least yet, maybe it comes further in the suit, but there's nothing here that is suggesting Samantha Vincent said, we no longer need any extra help because you resisted Vin Diesel's sexual assault. We'll see if that develops further in the case reading. For years, Ms. Jonasson remained silent, afraid to speak out against one of the world's highest-grossing actors, afraid she would be ostracized from the industry which had a pattern of protecting powerful men and silencing survivors of sexual harassment and assault, and concerned that, as a green card holder, that speaking out could jeopardize her potential future citizenship. Indeed, One Race required all employees to sign non-disclosure agreements to prevent them from discussing anything related to Vin Diesel. Indeed, One Race required all employees to sign non-disclosure agreements to prevent them from discussing anything related to Vin Diesel. And only Vin Diesel? Empowered by the Me Too and Time's Up movements, and with the protection of the Speak Out Act and recent revival of her claims by AB 2777. Now, AB 2777 is what amended Section 34016 of California's Code of Civil Procedure and expanded the date range, the statute of limitations, so people could bring forth a case such as one from 2010. Because of all that, Ms. Jonasson is unwilling to remain silent any longer and seeks to reclaim her agency and justice for the suffering she endured at the hands of Vin Diesel and One Race. So parties, we know plaintiff Jonasson is an adult female and at all times mentioned in this complaint was a resident of the state of California. Plaintiff was employed at One Race until her employment was wrongfully terminated in 2010. She was over the age of 18 at the time. And then the defendants. Defendant Vin Diesel is an individual and, on information and belief, a resident of Los Angeles County at all times mentioned in this complaint, and was a supervisor with and/or officer or director of One Race. On information and belief, in 1997, Vin Diesel legally changed his name from Mark Sinclair Vincent to Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel is an actor best known for his roles as Dominic Toretto in the Fast and Furious series, and the voice of Groot in the Guardians of the Galaxy film franchises, and has starred in Find Me Guilty and other films. Defendant Samantha Vincent is an individual and, on information and belief, a resident of Los Angeles County, and was a supervisor with and/or office or director at One Race. And then the 1 through 20 does. Plaintiff is ignorant of the true names and capacities of the defendants sued herein as does 1 through 20, inclusive, and therefore sues these defendants by fictitious names pursuant to Section 474 of the Code of Civil Procedure. Plaintiff will amend her complaint to allege the true names and capacities of the fictitiously named defendants as soon as they are ascertained, likely during discovery. Plaintiff believes that each of these fictitiously named defendants is responsible in some manner for the acts or omissions alleged herein, and that plaintiff's injuries and damages were proximately caused by the acts or omissions of these defendants. Now, when it says proximately caused, that means something that these fictitiously named defendants did, either by participating in or omitting to do, was related to the cause of the injuries and damages that the plaintiff allegedly suffered. And then the entity defendants. One Race Productions, Inc. was at all times mentioned in this complaint, authorized to operate by the state of California and the United States government, and authorized and qualified to do business in the county of Los Angeles. On information and belief, One Race Productions, Inc. is the film production company founded by Vin Diesel and was incorporated in California in 1997. On information and belief, One Race Films, Inc. was at all times mentioned in this complaint, authorized to operate by the state of California and the United States government, and then they list its address as being on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, California, and then they're letting us know that for the rest of this reading, One Race Productions, Inc., One Race Films, Inc., and does 1 through 20 will be herein referred to as entity defendants. So anytime we say entity defendants from here on out, it's referring to One Race Films and Productions and does 1 through 20. And then the relationship of dependents. On information and belief, all defendants compelled, coerced, aided, and/or abetted the discrimination, retaliation, and harassment alleged in this complaint, which conduct is prohibited under Section 12940 Subdivision I of the Government Code. All defendants were responsible for the events and damages alleged herein, including on the following basis. A. Defendants committed the acts alleged. B. At all relevant times, one or more of the defendants was the agent or employee and/or acted under the control or supervision of one or more of the remaining defendants, and, in committing the acts alleged, acted within the course and scope of such agency and employment, and/or is or are otherwise liable for plaintiff's damages. C. At all relevant times, there existed a unity of ownership and interest between or among two or more of the defendants, such that any individuality and separateness between or among those defendants has ceased. D. Defendants were the successors in interest and or alter egos of the other defendants in that they purchased, controlled, dominated, and operated each other without any separate identity, observation of formalities, or any other separateness. Adherence to the fiction of the separate existence of defendants would permit abuse of the corporate privilege and would perpetuate a fraud and injustice. All actions of all defendants were taken by employees, supervisors, executives, officers, and directors during employment with all defendants, were taken on behalf of all defendants, and were engaged in, authorized, ratified, and approved of by all other defendants. Consequently, each defendant is jointly and severably liable to plaintiff for the damages sustained as a proximate result of his, her, or its conduct. Each of the defendants proximately caused the injuries and damages alleged. Now, there could be a couple different arguments that come from this, but the main one I'm assuming they're going for is that just because Samantha Vincent is the one who called Asta Jonasson up and was like, hey, we don't need your services anymore. Sorry, you're terminated. By saying that all these co-defendants are related in their actions against the plaintiff, they're tying together the termination and the hostile work environment that is being alleged here with the parties, whether or not it was Vin Diesel himself that called her up, because it wasn't. It wasn't Vin Diesel himself that called Asta up and said, hey, I'm letting you go from this company because you resisted me in this hotel room. They're listing all of this out here because they're tying everything together in the order of events to demonstrate proximal cause. In other words, what happened to me isn't detached from me resisting Vin Diesel just because someone else came along and terminated me. Entity defendants directly and indirectly employed plaintiff as defined in the Fair Employment and Housing Act, so FEHA, I guess I'll say FEHA, at section 12926 subdivision D of the Government Code. In addition, entity defendants compelled, coerced, aided, and abetted the discrimination, which is prohibited under 12940 subdivision I of the Government Code. Finally, at all relevant times mentioned herein, all defendants acted as agents of the other defendants in committing the acts alleged herein. So again, that's tying it together, why all of the named parties in the suit are related and have some alleged responsibility over the alleged sexual battery and retaliation and hostile work environment that Asta Jonasson was subjected to. Whenever reference is made to defendants in this case, such allegations should be deemed to mean the acts of defendants acting individually, jointly, and or severally. So that sounds like it'll get a little bit messy, but we'll go through it. And they're establishing here that venue is proper jurisdiction for this to be brought forth in based on where the parties live, where the employment took place. Everything seems to have been in Los Angeles County. So now let's get to the factual allegations. Ms. Jonasson is a dedicated professional that has worked in the film industry for over a decade, and we saw that on her LinkedIn. After attending a year-long program at a film school, Ms. Jonasson gained experience working in the industry, including for 2 film production companies and 2 ultra-high-net-worth actors. Due to this experience, in 2010, Ms. Jonasson was referred to interview for a position at One Race. So we don't have much background there, that's pretty vague. But it's what opened the door for her to interview with this production company that Vin Diesel and Samantha Vincent own. In approximately August or September 2010, One Race interviewed Ms. Jonasson at its office in Beverly Hills. Tyrell Ty, Director of Marketing and Merchandising, interviewed Ms. Jonasson and recorded this interview using a professional camera and tripod. Ty assured Ms. Jonasson the recording was for the benefit of Samantha Vincent, president of One Race and Vin Diesel's sister. Ms. Jonasson later learned that Vin Diesel would say that if something is not on video, then it did not happen. Alright, so they're using that type of statement as they're going to tie that to the acts that happened here, but I'm going to pause there because, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. If I say something like that out loud, or proof or it didn't happen, or video or it didn't happen, if I say any one of those things, does that mean I did something weird in Las Vegas? Does that mean I did something, but it didn't actually happen because it's like the tree falling in the forest type thing. So they're taking a common thing here, proof or it didn't happen, and they're taking that statement to be a pointer, to be a signal that what she's alleging happened, if that makes sense. I'm not weighing in on the validity of that, but I'm just saying I bet that that's where they're going with this mention, that because of his demeanor and his statement, it shows a pattern of him trying to hide his behaviors by making sure the bad things he does aren't recorded. So I'm interested to see if this is just to put that idea in people's heads or if they're going to tie this into something later. During her interview, hiring, and throughout her employment, Miss Jonasson was led to believe that she would be assisting film production for the fifth installment of the Fast and Furious film franchise, Fast Five. At the time One Race hired Miss Jonasson, on or about September 2nd, Fast Five was in production in Atlanta, Georgia. Vincent contacted Miss Jonasson, instructed her to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and asked her how soon she could fly out to Atlanta. Eager to assist in the film production, Miss Jonasson communicated her immediate availability. One Race purchased a flight ticket for Miss Jonasson to arrive in Atlanta on or about the very next day. When Miss Jonasson arrived in Atlanta, she was greeted by another female employee who was also on location for Fast Five, and, in contradiction to the representations made during her hiring process, Miss Jonasson was informed that she would largely be assisting with projects personal to Vin Diesel and his family rather than the film production. So I wonder if they have this interview video, or plan to obtain it. Miss Jonasson addressed this contradiction with another person who, on information and belief, was a supervisor at One Race and was assured that she would be included in the film production. Now hold on. So the interview was approximately August or September 2010, and she says she was hired on or about September 2nd. Fast Five was already in production. They flew her out on or about the very next day. On or about September 3rd, Miss Jonasson was requested to join Vin Diesel's family at their Buckhead rental property. There, Miss Jonasson was tasked with planning a Labor Day barbecue for some of the Fast Five cast and above-the-line film crew members. And that's going to be September 6th was Labor Day that year. Vin Diesel's partner, Paloma Jimenez, told Miss Jonasson that the food servers at the barbecue must all be beautiful women. Understanding her assignment, Miss Jonasson also contracted an attractive female celebrity chef for the barbecue. Well, I looked and I don't see pictures coming up from that date range for anything involving Labor Day or Vin Diesel, but maybe it wasn't keyworded correctly. If someone wants to find those pictures, maybe that would be interesting. The barbecue, which took place on September 6, 2010, was attended by high-profile guests. Miss Jonasson received uniformly positive feedback on her performance in setting up the event. During the filming, Vin Diesel also had multiple rooms at the St. Regis Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia, including the hotel's most upscale room, the Empire Suite. On or about September 8, 2020, Miss Jonasson, Vin Diesel, another supervisor, and a female acquaintance of Miss Jonasson were making conversation in the Empire Suite. So, female acquaintance of Miss Jonasson. All in the Empire Suite. Vin Diesel and Miss Jonasson's acquaintance began speaking privately in the master bathroom. The other supervisor then instructed Miss Jonasson to follow him out of the Empire Suite. At the time, Miss Jonasson believed the supervisor intended to provide privacy for Vin Diesel and Miss Jonasson's female acquaintance. However, the supervisor continued entreating Miss Jonasson to follow him until they reached his hotel room. When Miss Jonasson entered the room, the lights were off and the supervisor did not move to turn the lights on. Instead, the supervisor took off his shirt and got into his bed and said, "Come here," to Miss Jonasson. Appalled, Miss Jonasson immediately exited the room in the hotel. On or about September 10, 2010, a supervisor instructed Miss Jonasson to go to the Havana Club in Atlanta as part of her work duties. When Miss Jonasson arrived at the nightclub, Vin Diesel was surrounded by club hostesses and approximately 2 of his private security personnel. Vin Diesel drank throughout the night and continued to socialize with the multiple female hostesses, each dressed in lingerie-inspired outfits. Jonasson did not drink alcohol as she was on the clock. In the early hours of the morning, Vin Diesel and his security left the club to return to the St. Regis Hotel. Approximately 4 or 5 hostesses from the nightclub returned with Vin Diesel to the hotel. However, Miss Jonasson's work for the night was not complete. Miss Jonasson was told to return to the hotel to continue working. And this is important language because it's saying that it was, employment. It's still her work time. That what we're about to hear is happening in terms of an employer-employee agency type relationship between the plaintiff and all of those co-defendants. Miss Jonasson arrived at the St. Regis at the same time as one of Vin Diesel's security guards. As both were headed towards the hotel elevator, another of Vin Diesel's security guards instructed that only Miss Jonasson was to continue up to the suite. When Miss Jonasson entered the Empire Suite, she observed Vin Diesel, one security guard, and approximately 5 hostesses from the nightclub. Quickly thereafter, the lone security guard exited the room. On information and belief, the security guard was instructed to leave so the hostesses would feel more comfortable around Vin Diesel. At one point, Vin Diesel told Miss Jonasson that she should have stayed close to him at the club so that if he had been secretly photographed with the hostesses, Vin Diesel would have the cover that his assistant was also in the photo. Then, Vin Diesel and one of the nightclub hostesses retreated to the main bedroom for an extended period of time. The other hostesses remained in the living room of the suite with Miss Jonasson for some time. Eventually, all but one hostess left the living room, apparently tired of waiting for Vin Diesel to reappear. After a significant period of time, Miss Jonasson received a phone call from Vin Diesel's security stating that Vin Diesel was not answering his cell phone and that he needed to immediately leave the hotel. Then, the hostess exited the bedroom, leaving the door open, joined her waiting coworker, and both exited the hotel suite. Still tasked with ushering Vin Diesel out of the hotel, Miss Jonasson entered the main bedroom to find Vin Diesel lying clothed, sideways on the bed, with his cell phone on the dresser. Miss Jonasson stood at the side of the bed near Vin Diesel's feet and informed Vin Diesel that his security team had called, urged him to answer his phone, and that it was time to leave the hotel. As she did so, Miss Jonasson picked up Vin Diesel's phone from the dresser and motioned for him to take it. Instead of taking his phone, Vin Diesel grabbed Miss Jonasson's wrists, one with each of his hands, and pulled her onto the bed. Miss Jonasson landed on the bed, facing Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel entrapped Miss Jonasson in a bear hug as she immediately tried to escape his grasp and get off the bed. Miss Jonasson tried to de-escalate the situation, telling Vin Diesel to stop while continuing to attempt to wrest free of Vin Diesel's grasp. Eventually, Miss Jonasson was able to squirm away from Vin Diesel's embrace and took the opportunity to drop Vin Diesel's cell phone into a pocket of his cargo shorts, expecting that Vin Diesel would refuse to take his cell phone if she offered it to him again. And that's important because that's going to come back into play. So she squirms away from Vin Diesel's embrace, but takes the opportunity to drop Vin Diesel's cell phone into a pocket of his cargo shorts. Miss Jonasson then ran out of the bedroom and stood by the front door of the suite for Vin Diesel to gather himself and leave. Shortly thereafter, Vin Diesel left the bedroom and began walking towards Miss Jonasson. Miss Jonasson hoped he would leave without any further incident, and Miss Jonasson instantly reached for the door so Vin Diesel would exit the suite. Vin Diesel immediately stated, "Don't open the door." Miss Jonasson followed his instruction, unsure if Vin Diesel was still intoxicated and growing increasingly concerned that he would not leave. Vin Diesel then approached Miss Jonasson, forcibly hugging her, and continued to embrace her for an extended period of time. Miss Jonasson was extremely uncomfortable but felt powerless to stop Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel was her supervisor, was physically larger and stronger than Miss Jonasson, and Miss Jonasson was afraid for her personal safety and job security if she were to anger him. Vin Diesel proceeded to grope Miss Jonasson's body, including her breasts, and forcibly kiss Miss Jonasson, who continually pleaded with him to stop. Vin Diesel ignored her pleas and started to kiss Miss Jonasson's chest and collarbone. Miss Jonasson was afraid to more forcibly refuse her supervisor, knowing that getting him out of that room was both crucial and her personal safety and job security. But this hope died when Vin Diesel dropped to his knees, pushed Miss Jonasson's dress up towards her waist, and molested her body, running his hands over Miss Jonasson's upper legs, including her inner thighs. Vin Diesel moved to pull Miss Jonasson's underwear down. At that moment, Miss Jonasson screamed and in a panic ran down the hallway towards the bathroom, knocking Vin Diesel to the floor. Vin Diesel then stood up and walked over to Miss Jonasson, pinned her to the wall with the left side of his body, and began to grope Miss Jonasson's body, including her breasts. Vin Diesel then grabbed Miss Jonasson's left hand and placed it on his erect penis, which was covered only by his underwear as Vin Diesel had unzipped or partly pulled down his cargo shorts during the sexual assault. Disgusted, Miss Jonasson immediately pulled her hand away and verbally refused. Vin Diesel ignored Miss Jonasson's clear statement and actions of non-consent. So, statement, maybe that's supposed to be plural, but it is singular there. And the reason I bring that up is because we have statements, plural, at the very beginning. So back to where we just left off. If that's supposed to be plural, I mean, that sucks because like a grammar check might not catch it. Because clear statement and clear statements both make grammatical sense, but it changes the meaning a little bit. A statement of no is still a statement of no, but many statements of no is a lot clearer. And on the flip side, you don't want there to be a discrepancy if this goes to trial and they question her, well, you said statements and then you say statement. It sounds like I'm pulling hairs because if someone says no one time, that's enough, right? But that kind of hair splitting is something that might occur during trial, during testimony, during examination. So what could be a simple typo there is a little bit significant. Vin Diesel ignored Miss Jonasson's clear statements and actions of non-consent and pulled his penis out of his underwear. Vin Diesel then began to masturbate, still pinning Miss Jonasson to the wall with his left side of his body. Terrified, Miss Jonasson closed her eyes, trying to dissociate from the sexual assault and avoid angering him. Miss Jonasson heard Vin Diesel making groaning noises, then Vin Diesel quickly released her, went to the bathroom, and turned on the sink with the bathroom door open. Miss Jonasson was in complete shock, unable to move and feeling stuck to the wall. Vin Diesel then exited the bathroom and looked at Miss Jonasson and said, "No one can say shit about Asta," walking past her as he left the suite. On information and belief, Vin Diesel was referencing that Miss Jonasson was not an easy or willing conquest, including her prior refusal to engage in sexual relations with another supervisor. And I'd love to know your thoughts there. If someone was like, no one can say shit about Kat, what would you take that to mean? And the reason I think this is important is because this is the second example of things that were said that the plaintiff is asserting as having a specific meaning that relates to the damages alleged. Because earlier we saw with the video cameras, if it wasn't on video, it didn't happen or whatever, that phrase was also being asserted as something that Vin Diesel said that was related to the alleged acts as they relate to the complaints for damages in this complaint. And here we're seeing it again with the quote, no one can say shit about Asta, where the plaintiff is inferring that on information and belief, Vin Diesel was referencing that Miss Jonasson was not an easy or willing conquest, including her prior refusal to engage in sexual relations with another supervisor. So if someone were to say no one can say shit about Kat, or no one can say shit about blank, no one can say shit about your own name, fill it in, what is the assertion there? What is the inference there? Because if we were to go along with the inference made here, the assertion made here on information and belief, not an easy or willing conquest, including her prior refusal to engage in sexual relations with another supervisor. So that would be September 8th. Miss Jonasson turned down the supervisor, and maybe that means September 9th, maybe that means September 8th before midnight, maybe it's September 9th after midnight. And then on September 10th, which could be by the time this is all being alleged, it could be after midnight, which might make it the 11th. It's not really clear. But let's say there was a 48-hour window here between the 10th and the 8th where she turned down the supervisor. The assertion here implies that Vin Diesel was aware of the prior refusal to engage in sexual relations with another supervisor. So that implication seems to be part of this information and belief that's allowing plaintiff to come to that conclusion. And it would also be an implication that these coworkers, these people that were all related in some capacity in an employment relationship, discussed these types of things with one another. Or it could just be a guess and a loose interpretation of the phrase, no one can say shit about blank. As she stood alone in the suite, Miss Jonasson suddenly felt a mix of relief that the sexual assault was over and panic, and her heart felt like it was about to explode out of her chest. Unexpectedly, Vin Diesel returned and Miss Jonasson felt instantaneous terror. Vin Diesel asked for his phone, and Miss Jonasson managed to respond that the phone was in his pocket. Vin Diesel responded, "Good job," and finally exited the hotel suite. Mere hours later, on or about September 11th, 2010. So it says mere hours later. So this September 2010 sounds like it was a late night into midnight the morning of September 11th, because now we're saying mere hours later. On or about September 11th, 2010, as Miss Jonasson was still processing the immediate aftermath of Vin Diesel's sexual assault, Samantha Vincent called Jonasson and stated that One Race no longer needed, quote, any extra help, end quote, and terminated Miss Jonasson's employment. Vincent also stated Miss Jonasson would be paid for a full 2 weeks of work, even though Miss Jonasson worked less than 2 weeks. Miss Jonasson had previously received praise for her work at One Race, and it was clear to her that she was being fired because she was no longer useful. So we have the barbecue praise. Vin Diesel had used her to fulfill his sexual desires, and she had resisted his sexual assaults. Miss Jonasson felt like she was a piece of trash to be discarded. Miss Jonasson felt hopeless, her self-esteem was demolished, and she questioned her own skills and whether a successful career would require her to trade her body for advancement. Now, I think if something like this happened to anybody, it's reasonable you're going to feel like your self-esteem is you're questioning your self-esteem, you're questioning your own skills. If it's in the capacity of someone that's part of your career field and your aspirations in life, you might question whether you're destined for success or if you're destined to stay where you are. But I do think if this goes to trial, they're going to question her on her opening paragraph of this complaint, where she says she already works for high-profile people, and that's what actually opened the door for her to this. The door was already opened. And we don't have any information that she had to trade her body for advancement at that point with those two high-profile people that she worked with that opened this door. So it's a very valid question, but I'm just saying if this goes to trial, probably be questioned about that. On information and belief, entity defendants engaged in a cover-up or attempted a cover-up of a previous instance or allegations of sexual assault by an alleged perpetrator of such abuse, including but not limited to using non-disclosure agreements. Prior to filing this action, plaintiff exhausted her administrative remedies by filing a timely administrative complaint with the California Civil Rights Department and receiving a CCRD right to sue letter. Now, interestingly, entity defendants, so that's One Race Films, One Race Productions Incorporated, and the 1 through 20 does, engaged in a cover-up or attempted a cover-up of a previous instance or allegations of sexual assault by an alleged perpetrator of such abuse. And they're saying that they tried to use non-disclosure agreements to do so. Now, the causes of actions, a lot of the text is going to repeat itself. I did provide the link if you want to read it in full. But let's get the big picture of it. So first cause of action is discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. And this is alleged against all the entity defendants. And the important part here is that as a proximate result of entity defendants' willful, knowing, and intentional discrimination against plaintiff has sustained and continues to sustain substantial losses of earnings and other employment benefits. That's interesting because we saw that after she was terminated, she went on to work for 10 years with tenure and even was promoted within 2 years to a director position with Disney. Although we don't see that part about Disney mentioned anywhere so far in the complaint, that's just information we're getting from her own LinkedIn, which presumably she listed herself. So we can hope or expect that it would be true and correct. And if it's not true and correct, but she's the one that wrote her own LinkedIn profile, that wouldn't be a good thing for the plaintiff. And then plaintiff is alleging that they've suffered and continue to suffer humiliation, emotional distress, and mental and physical pain and anguish. So we have physical pain and anguish. So maybe that's physiological. The mental and emotional strain is so tasking that holistically it becomes physically symptomatic. I don't think we have anything alleged thus far that something caused her physical pain, like physical injury, any scratching, any hits, with nothing stated, any sustained injuries from that. So that's interesting, that physical pain and anguish. And then they're also going after legal expenses and attorney fees. And the acts of defendants alleged herein were undertaken with the intent to injure plaintiff or with a willful and conscious disregard of her rights and constitute oppressive and malicious conduct. Second cause of action is hostile work environment harassment on the basis of sex/gender against Vin Diesel and the entity defendants. And they're stating here that a reasonable person in plaintiff's circumstances would have considered the work environment to be hostile or abusive, and that the plaintiff did in fact consider the work environment to be hostile or abusive. And at the time of the relevant conduct, Vincent and Vin Diesel were acting as plaintiff's supervisors. The harassing conduct was a substantial factor in causing plaintiff's harm. Third cause of action, retaliation for engaging in protected activity. And this is actually important because it's why, typically we think of workplace retaliation as, you're an employee and you report your manager as engaging in misconduct, and then your employer takes retaliatory action against you. The idea is that a complaint is lodged, and then the employer retaliates against the person making the complaint. But here we get some clarity. So this statute requires entity defendants to refrain from retaliating against any employee making complaints or opposing discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, or otherwise engaging in activity protected by the FEHA, including for seeking to exercise rights guaranteed under FEHA and opposing entity defendants' failure to provide rights. So that or part here, or opposing discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, is important because there's nothing here as part of the factual allegations that Jonasson actually went and lodged a complaint that this had happened to her. The retaliatory action, the third cause of action here, they're saying it applies because she opposed the discrimination, harassment, or otherwise engaging in the activity that she was protected against, according to FEHA. Plaintiffs seeking to exercise rights guaranteed under FEHA and or opposing entity defendants' failure to provide such rights, including the right to be free of discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, were substantial motivating reasons in entity defendants' decisions to terminate plaintiff's employment, not retain, hire, or otherwise employ plaintiff in any position, and or take other adverse employment actions against plaintiff. And then here we also have, as a proximate result of entity defendants' willful, knowing, and intentional retaliation against plaintiff has suffered and continues to suffer humiliation, emotional distress, and mental and physical pain and anguish, all to her damage in a sum according to proof. Entity defendants' retaliation was committed intentionally in a malicious, fraudulent, despicable, and or oppressive manner and this entitles plaintiff to punitive damages against entity defendants. And then legal fees. Fourth cause of action is failure to prevent discrimination, harassment, and retaliation, and this is against the entity defendants. And this is because plaintiff was allegedly subjected to sexual harassment in the course of employment because of her gender and sex. During the course of plaintiff's employment, entity defendants failed to prevent their employees from engaging in intentional actions that resulted in plaintiff suffering discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. And plaintiff has suffered substantial loss of earnings and other employment benefits. We again see that as a proximate result, it has caused not just humiliation and emotional distress, but also physical and mental pain and anguish, and that it was intentional in a malicious, fraudulent, despicable, and/or oppressive manner. So punitive damages should be on the table, and attorney's fees. Fifth cause of action is retaliation in violation of labor code, and that's against all defendants. And the reason being here is that the labor code was in effect and was binding on all the defendants. So the statute provides in part that an employer or any person acting on behalf of the employer shall not retaliate against an employee for disclosing information or because the employer believes that the employee disclosed or may disclose information to a government or law enforcement agency, to a person with authority over the employee or another employee who has the authority to investigate, discover, or correct the violation or noncompliance, if the employee has reasonable cause to believe that the information discloses a violation of law. The statute also further provides that an employer or any person acting on behalf of the employer shall not retaliate against an employee for refusing to participate in an activity that would result in a violation of state or federal statute or a violation of or non-compliance with a local, state, or federal rule or regulation. So here, the entity defendants were plaintiff's employer, and Vincent and Vin Diesel were persons acting on behalf of plaintiff's employer. Plaintiff engaged in protected activity when she disclosed, or her employer thought she may disclose, so we don't actually have that clarified here. So there's nothing in the factual allegations here that says that Asta Jonasson went to somebody on September 10th or 11th and was like, hey, this just happened to me. That's why this or is important here. Or her employer thought she may disclose reasonable suspicions of violations of law to defendants who had authority over plaintiff and had authority to investigate, discover, or correct the violations or noncompliance alleged above. Plaintiff also engaged in protected activity for resisting and refusing to participate in sexual harassment and sexual assault. Plaintiff had a reasonable belief that defendants were violating actual or potential state and federal laws and regulations, including but not limited to engaging in a sexual harassment and sexual assault in violation of Government Code Section 12900. Defendants retaliated against plaintiff for protected activity by taking adverse employment action against plaintiff, including by terminating her employment in violation of the Labor Code. Plaintiff's protected activity was a significant factor in defendant's decision to terminate plaintiff's employment. And that's to me, that's tough, because you're going to have to say that of this approximately 9-day employment, that this one thing that happened, you're saying that they intentionally retaliated, that specifically Samantha Vincent, on behalf of Vin Diesel and One Race, intentionally and knowingly retaliated against you to fire you because they believed you would say something. So I'm wondering how they're going to make the case that this protected activity was known by these other entities, including Samantha. Because it's one thing for Vin Diesel, if this happened as alleged, if these factual allegations are true, it's one thing for Vin Diesel to go and say, hey, fire this person, they're not working out, and then the entity just goes but doesn't have the intent, that doesn't have malice. It might not have been a significant factor for the entity defendant, the rest of the entity defendants. Because in this case, Samantha Vincent is also named as an individual. And it could just be a catch-all for now for these causes of action to be against all defendants, and then they can fight to exclude themselves. And then they want punitive damages. There's no physical harm alleged here, but just lost earnings, salary, other job benefits, humiliation, embarrassment, and emotional distress. Sixth cause of action is violation of labor code against all defendants. And this is, entity defendants were plaintiff's employer. Vincent and Vin Diesel were persons acting on behalf of the employer. And then we have that or again. Plaintiff engaged in protected activity when she disclosed or her employer thought she may disclose reasonable suspicions of violations of law to defendants. Plaintiff had a reasonable belief that defendants were violating actual or potential state and federal laws and regulations, including but not limited to engaging in sexual harassment and sexual assault, and that the defendants retaliated against plaintiff for protected activity by taking adverse employment action against plaintiff. that the protected activity was a significant factor in the defendant's decision to terminate plaintiff's employment. And again, no physical harm here, everything else instead. Seventh cause of action is wrongful termination in violation of public policy. And they're saying that at all times material here too, so the 9 days of employment. The labor code was in full force and effect and was binding on entity defendants. So these laws require entity defendants to refrain from, among other things, retaliating against employees who disclose to their employer or refuse to participate in or condone conduct they reasonably believe to violate state or federal laws or regulations, including unsafe work conditions. The public has a fundamental interest in a workplace free from discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. And it's the same thing: punitive damages, legal expenses. Eighth cause of action, and this is sexual battery against all defendants. The allegations set forth in preceding paragraphs are realleged and incorporated herein by reference. Vin Diesel intentionally subjected plaintiff to acts of sexual assault and battery, including causing harm and offensive contact with plaintiff's sexual organs and breasts, and a sexually offensive contact with plaintiff resulted either directly or indirectly. Through these actions, Vin Diesel intended to cause harmful or offensive contact with plaintiff's person and or intended to put plaintiff in imminent apprehension of such contact. These incidents of sexual assault occurred while plaintiff was an employee of entity defendants and their agent acting on behalf of entity defendants. Vin Diesel did the aforementioned acts with the intent to cause a harmful or offensive contact with an intimate part of plaintiff's person and would offend a reasonable sense of personal dignity. Further, said acts did cause a harmful or offensive contact with an intimate part of plaintiff's person that would offend a reasonable sense of personal dignity. Plaintiff did not consent to the touching. Vin Diesel's sexual battery of plaintiff fell within the scope of plaintiff's employment for the purposes of respondeat superior. The sexual battery was engendered by or arose from the employment. As such, entity defendants are liable for Vin Diesel's sexual battery of plaintiff. And this is vicarious liability, so basically that because of the agency-employer relationship here, because plaintiff was an employee and Vin Diesel did this, and he has relation to all these entity defendants, that the entity defendants bear vicarious liability for the sexual battery. So that's why this cause of action is named against all defendants. On information and belief, even though entity defendants and Vincent had actual knowledge of these activities by Vin Diesel, entity defendants and Vincent did nothing to investigate, supervise, or monitor Vin Diesel to ensure the safety of its employees or those subordinate to Vin Diesel in his capacity as a supervisor. And this is where earlier we saw that paragraph mentioning possible other alleged protected activities and non-disclosures that may be alluding to someone else. This is also saying activities. And it doesn't really mention the supervisor that tried to invite Jonasson into the bed here. It specifically says Vin Diesel, so I'm wondering what this is alluding to. Time may tell. On information and belief, entity defendants and Vincent ratified and authorized Vin Diesel's sexual assault of plaintiff by 1. Failing to discharge, dismiss, discipline, suspend, and or supervise Vin Diesel after receiving notice that Vin Diesel sexually assaulted plaintiff. 2. Placing Vin Diesel in... Hold on, let's see. And this is an and. So these 5 items are all and. So this isn't an or situation, this is an and. So this is the first time we're seeing after receiving notice. But we don't know when they received the notice or by whom. On information and belief, entity defendants and Vincent ratified and authorized Vin Diesel's sexual assault of plaintiff by 1. Failing to discharge, dismiss, discipline, suspend, and or supervise Vin Diesel after receiving notice that Vin Diesel sexually assaulted plaintiff. So that notice is specifically about this plaintiff. 2. Placing Vin Diesel in and allowing him to create a workplace environment where he would supervise or control the conduct of plaintiff and other subordinate employees during, before, and after the workday. Now remember, everything that was alleged under the factual allegations was during the workday. It was stated that Jonasson was still on the clock and that her supervisors were still asking her to go and check on him, that it was requests as part of her employment position that she had to go check on him. He wasn't answering the phone. So all of the factual allegations that we read above were posited as during the time of work, being on the clock. 3. Actively shielding Vin Diesel from responsibility of his sexual assault of plaintiff. So I wonder when this is actually taking place. That's what I'm most interested in. When was this notice about Vin Diesel sexually assaulting plaintiff given? And what was the resulting, what's alleged here to be active shielding of Vin Diesel from responsibility? 4. Failing to inform or concealing from law enforcement officials that the fact entity defendants knew or had reason to know Vin Diesel may have sexually assaulted plaintiff, thereby enabling plaintiff to continue to be endangered and sexually assaulted. And, okay, wait, pause there, because whether they knew or not at the time of her termination, it said she was terminated within hours of it taking place. So thereby enabling plaintiff to continue to be endangered and sexually assaulted. So if she said she was in the hotel room by herself, and then it jumps a few hours later, she was no longer needed. So this seems inconsistent, unless they're implying that even after termination, she was still at risk of being endangered and sexually assaulted by Vin Diesel. So I'm confused on this one as far as when, how, where, and what exactly applies to the plaintiff's experience here. But maybe we'll find out in the next couple pages. And 5. And. Remember, that's an and. So all 5 of these items. And failing to take reasonable steps and to implement reasonable safeguards and/or policies to avoid acts of unlawful sexual misconduct by Vin Diesel. As a proximate result of defendant's actions, plaintiff has and will continue to suffer harm, including lost earnings, salary, and other job benefits, and humiliation, embarrassment, and emotional distress, according to proof. Defendant's misconduct was committed intentionally, in a malicious, fraudulent, despicable, and/or oppressive manner, and this entitles plaintiff to punitive damages against defendants. 9th cause of action is negligent supervision and retention against entity defendants. Entity defendants have a duty to protect its employees, including plaintiff. Entity defendants were required but failed to provide adequate supervision and failed to be properly vigilant in ensuring that such supervision was sufficient to ensure the safety of plaintiff and others. Now that's probably, the security guard leaving the room would be a good sign at not being properly vigilant in ensuring proper supervision and safety. Entity defendants had a duty to and failed to adequately train and supervise all employees on sexual harassment and assault, and to implement any procedures or complaint process for employees to report or seek refuge from sexual harassment. Now that's important because you've heard me point out, well, was a complaint actually lodged? Well, here they're getting ahead of that and saying, hey, the entity defendants had a duty to provide a way for us to lodge a complaint, and they didn't do that. Entity defendants had a duty to investigate plaintiff's complaint of sexual harassment and not retaliate against her. This is again suggesting that a complaint was lodged by the plaintiff and not retaliate against her. The retaliation seems to be the termination. So I'm getting confused because in these causes of action, that's twice now, it's being stated that the defendants had a duty to investigate the complaint but didn't, and instead terminated her. But in the factual allegations reading, it was not stated that she lodged a complaint. So this is unclear to me. Maybe retaliate against her is something that applies beyond the termination. But otherwise, there's nothing, unless I missed it, there's nothing as part of those factual allegations where plaintiff lodged a complaint to any of the entity defendants that she had been sexually harassed by an employee. And then entity defendants owed a duty of care to plaintiff to appoint, hire, retain, and supervise persons who would not engage in retaliatory, harassing, or discriminatory conduct, and not to retain managers, supervisors, or employees who would discriminate against, harass, or retaliate against employees for engaging in protected activities. Entity defendants owed a duty of care to plaintiff to supervise its managers and employees closely to ensure that they would refrain from harassing and retaliating against plaintiff. Entity defendants' conduct, actions, and omissions served to create an environment in which Vin Diesel was permitted to sexually abuse and assault plaintiff. Upon report of plaintiff's assaults, entity defendants should have investigated and appropriately responded to such complaints and should have taken action to further protect plaintiff. So still, when was the report of the plaintiff's assault? Because earlier, it says, for years, Ms. Jonasson remained silent, afraid to speak out against one of the world's highest-grossing actors, afraid she would be ostracized from the industry. They mention that there was a non-disclosure. And now because she feels empowered, Ms. Jonasson is unwilling to remain silent any longer. So I am confused there. Where was this duty to act promptly and diligently? What is that time frame? Because when was this report made? There was no report stated, no complaint lodged in the factual allegations part of this complaint. It's just something being mentioned as part of 3 causes of action now that the plaintiff reported upon report of plaintiff's assaults. But when was this report made? And if the report wasn't made contemporaneously, I'm curious to know how that impacts the duty to act promptly and diligently and to not ignore or minimize problems. Because if this report was made years later, maybe there's not much to due diligence on and the problem might not exist anymore, even if it did in the past. So there might be nothing to minimize. I don't know. There's a big question there for me about when any report that the plaintiff made was actually made. So yeah, I just have questions because she was apparently silent for years. We don't have any knowledge of her lodging a complaint within those few hours where she got that phone call from Samantha Vincent saying, "We no longer have need for your services." But yeah. 10th cause of action, intentional infliction of emotional distress against all defendants. Defendant's conduct as alleged herein was outrageous and exceeds all bounds of decency and is odious and utterly intolerable in a civilized society. Vin Diesel's sexual battery of and gender violence towards plaintiff constituted extreme and outrageous misconduct. This misconduct arose out of plaintiff's employment with entity defendants and was therefore ratified by entity defendants and Vincent. A reasonable person would not expect or tolerate Vin Diesel's sexual harassment and assaults, and defendant's knowledge and callous indifference thereof. Again, where was this callous indifference happening? When was this report made? When did they become aware? Plaintiff had great trust, faith, and confidence in defendants, which, by virtue of defendant's wrongful conduct, turned to fear. A reasonable person would not expect or tolerate the defendants and their agents to be incapable of supervising and or stopping participants and members of defendants, including Vin Diesel, from committing wrongful sexual acts with other employees, including plaintiff, or to report Vin Diesel. As a direct and proximate result of defendants' tortious acts, omissions, wrongful conduct, and breaches of their duties, plaintiff has suffered injury, all to her general, special, and consequential damage in an amount to be proven at trial, but in no event less than the minimum jurisdictional amount of this court. Defendants' conduct described herein caused plaintiff severe emotional distress. Defendants were aware that treating plaintiff in the manner alleged above, including depriving plaintiff of her livelihood, would devastate plaintiff and cause her extreme hardship. I mean, this was a 9-day employment. They offered her full 2 weeks, and she went on to work 10 years with tenure and a promotion 2 years into a director position with Disney. I would be interested to see the damages argument part of this trial if it goes to trial. And we've got the physical pain coming back in here. Plaintiff is informed and based thereon allegations that the conduct of defendants was oppressive, malicious, manipulative, and despicable, and that it was intentional and done in conscious disregard for the rights and safety of others, and were carried out with a conscious disregard of their rights to be free from such tortious behavior, such as to constitute oppression, fraud, or malice, entitling plaintiff to punitive damages against defendant in an appropriate amount to punish and set an example of defendants. Prayer for relief. Wherefore, plaintiff prays for judgment against defendants as follows. For compensatory damages and other special and general damages according to proof, including without limitation, lost earnings, salary, bonuses, and other job benefits plaintiff would have received but for defendant's wrongful conduct, emotional distress damages, punitive and exemplary damages in an amount sufficient to punish defendants and to make an example of and deter defendants from engaging in such conduct in the future, statutory damages and penalties as appropriate, including without limitation, for a civil penalty of $10,000 for each violation of Sections 98.6 and 1102.5 of the Labor Code, for an award of reasonable attorney fees and costs incurred in this action, for prejudgment and post-judgment interest as provided by law, and for other and further relief as the court may deem just and proper. This was filed yesterday, December 21st, 2023, by Greenberg Gross, signed by Brian L. Williams, Claire Lise Y. Cutley, Matthew T. Hale. And then demand for a jury trial, signed by the same. So my thoughts, and obviously let me know yours. I need to know when and if a report or complaint was lodged by Asta Jonasson to any of the entity defendants. That's huge to me because some of the causes of action are implying that a report was made, but prompt action wasn't taken. But if the report wasn't prompt, that kind of alters a reasonable expectation of due diligence and prompt response. I'm also very curious about, it wasn't in all of the causes of action, but I think it was in 7, maybe 6 of them, of the 10, the physical pain. So what is the physical injury caused by this? The most forceful part of the allegations, of the factual allegations contained in this complaint, was a groping, maybe groping of the breast, moving the hands up the thigh, but there wasn't like a sustained physical injury alleged. And there certainly wasn't an allegation in this complaint about a chronic and debilitating physical injury sustained because of the actions of Vin Diesel or any of the entity defendants. So number 2 for me is, where is this physical pain coming from? Is it just something that's manifesting from the emotional anguish? It's becoming physiological. 3, since plaintiff is claiming emotional distress still to this day, there could be a court-ordered evaluation, an IME. I'd be interested in that because they're going to have to go back 12 years, almost 13 years, 13 years, yeah, like 13 years to determine if what she's experiencing now started and can be attributed to that moment in time. 4, I'm obviously interested in what proof exists, not just of the underlying event, which, something bad can happen to you 10 years ago and you might be asked out trying to figure out how to prove your case to anybody, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. We did see certain things mentioned, especially as it relates to the entity defendant's responsibility in this matter, the culpability in this matter, the vicarious liability in this matter. Things like the interview recording that Ty recorded during her interview. Maybe that tape exists. Maybe they're in possession of that tape or plan to or hope to get that tape upon discovery in this case. And maybe it contains something interesting. Maybe there's some proof from this Labor Day barbecue. Maybe there's proof of her being praised for her work. Maybe she has a thank you message or email from somebody. Maybe there's correspondence between the supervisor, the security that left the hotel suite while contacting Asta Jonasson and saying, hey, Vin Diesel's not answering his phone, what's going on? And maybe there's text correspondence there that can come into play. Maybe there's other witnesses that can come into play. 5, there was a slight hint at other allegations, not just other allegations against Vin Diesel, but there was a mention that there may have been another possible allegation that the entity defendants didn't take action to protect its employers in regards to. 6, damages. Juries are unpredictable things, so it can go either way no matter what is said, but I would be curious if this goes to trial. They're going to have to make a case for the damages incurred, and if they have to go back to damages incurred, this all happened. This was like 9 days of 9 days of employment. There was a gap between September 11th, 2010, and then we have listed here executive assistant January 2012, starting with Disney, and then by January 2014, so 2 years after starting, there was a promotion to director of development. And overall, this spanned 10 years and 6 months until freelancing started. Disney ended in June 2022, and then freelance is listed July 2022. So maybe they want to allege damages between 2010. Maybe they want to allege that she could have been making more during her time here. But they're going to bring this up, that whatever happened with you and Vin Diesel, especially if there was no contemporaneous report made at that time, there's no reason to suggest that Walt Disney had any awareness that this thing took place or held it against her in their hiring decision. We would want to hear, did she apply at other places and reasonably believes that she was turned down for those jobs between September 2010 and January 2012 because the prospective employer had awareness of what happened in September 2010 and held that against her in terms of hiring. But I still think it's interesting. She had a 10.5-year tenure with the Disney company, was promoted to director of development. That's a higher role. So even if she can make the case against Vin Diesel's actions and prove that, hey, this happened to me and he did this to me, I'm wondering how they would argue damages and also vicarious liability of all the entity defendants for possible loss of income and opportunity. And then lastly, I'd be curious to see if others come forward now that Asta Jonasson has filed something. I'm interested in the response to this. We have a statement completely denying it, but that doesn't mean a settlement couldn't be reached. And again, this isn't exactly my type of case that I'm interested in, but I do like to see when it's a higher profile case And it involves such a distance in time, right? This is over 10 years ago. It makes the question of proof and what is proof and what could a jury decide is proof versus us out here outside of the jury box. If this were to go to trial, we're outside of the jury box. We have our conversations. We have access to more information that the jury's not supposed to go and search for. We do have people talking about, having vibes about Vin Diesel all along, and this clip has resurfaced.
God, you're so beautiful. God, she's so beautiful, man. Am I right or wrong? Look at her. How am I supposed to do this interview? Look at this woman.
Tell me your story.
She's so beautiful. Coño, man. Talk to me, baby. Tell me your story. Tell me yours. Let's get out of here. Let's go. Let's go have lunch. My God, I love her. Look how beautiful she is.
Thank you.
God, wow, man.
So, Tom Hanks?
Wow, man. Yeah, Tom Hanks.
Tom Hanks.
Great
Hanks, guy.
He was a great guy, and he kind of told me what it was going to be like to be a movie star.
And the last thing I saw you speaking I am Groot in so many languages, but I don't know if you ever said it in Portuguese. So I brought you...
I did say it in Portuguese.
Did you? Eu sou o Groot.
Eu sou o Groot.
Eu sou o Groot.
I love her. Man, she's so fucking sexy. I can't do this interview. Look at her.
Eu sou o Groot.
Does anyone say this? Guys, what's wrong? Am I the only one that's saying it? Look at her. She's so fucking beautiful. It's like you can't even do an interview with her because you're just like, da, 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 da. Right or wrong? Oh my God, guys, someone save me. When did this turn into beautiful world? When did this turn into the most gorgeous girl in Brazil? When did this turn into I love you?
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
And then the reactions, this is so creepy. Holy shit, bro has been weird. So just brand the man guilty on a self-interested accusation. I hope you're never accused of anything. When did I say he was guilty? Ew. I think it was confirmed that he went into the interview intoxicated. Vin has never been himself since Paul Walker passed away, but wait, what's going on with Vin Diesel? And then they just tell him the accusations. Have y'all never flirted? Like, damn. One of the cringiest interviews ever. Gross. Now, Carol, in a interview that was translated, this is Portuguese to English translation, she did give an interview with the New York Daily News. This was in 2016, by the way. She said, he began to hit on me in the middle of the interview, say that I was pretty, and he interrupted the interview 3 times to talk about it. I was laughing, completely uncomfortable. I did not like it. At the time, I did not know how to react, but you will see that I was uncomfortable. It was not nice that he interrupted my work. So then Vin Diesel had actually posted a full-length interview, I'll link it in the description if you want to go watch it, with an apology saying, hey, as you all know, I try to keep my interviews playful and fun, especially when I'm in the Xander zone. But if I offended anyone, then let me apologize because that's never my intention. Here is the uncut version. And then there's 16,000 comments. I'm sure there's some new ones that have trickled in, but they're mostly from 6 years ago when it was first posted. So some people think it was uncomfortable, others think it wasn't uncomfortable. So there's that, and it seems like this interview is going to get a revival of reactions now that this new allegation has come forward. Just in general, if something happened to someone 10 years ago, truly happened to them 10 years ago, how can we bring them justice, even if proof might be limited? And on the flip side, how can we help protect and advocate for the rights of a defendant? Now, this is civil, this isn't criminal. So the burden of proof is different. This isn't like a beyond a reasonable doubt thing. But at the same time, the allegations involve accusations of criminal activity, right? Sexual battery. The allegations here involve a criminal act that is very personally violating. So those are just my general thoughts. I think I have a lot of questions here because it was a 9-day employment relationship with 10 years of tenure at Disney after. So I'm curious about the causes of actions and the damages claims attached to them. I'm also curious about when and how the plaintiff made a report against not just Vin Diesel, but the entity defendants. So I am interested in seeing a response. I don't feel like we have that much to go on at this point in time. We have claims of a sexual encounter that the plaintiff alleges was sexual battery and non-consensual in September 2010. And even though it would normally be outside the statute of limitations, the California Speak Out Act and the amendment that they made to 34016 of Bill, what was it, 2777, allows for this longer look-back period for this case to be brought forward. So it's a little bit similar to what we're seeing in New York because of, their extension of the look-back period for the Adult Survivors Act. But you guys take it from here. We have a categorical denial from Vin Diesel's team. I don't think there's statements yet from any of the other accused entities, and that's going to be a whole mess. That could be a bunch of different parties having their own counsel, and then they might seek to independently have themselves removed from the entire complaint or some of the causes of action. It's always a bit more interesting when multiple parties are involved as co-defendants. But right now we do have Vin Diesel as an individual through a statement from his attorney categorically denying these allegations. And we have the complaint, the factual allegations, which you just heard here. So it's your time to give your thoughts. Let me know what you think. It's totally okay to have an opinion or not have an opinion yet. Just let me know what you think and give us a sneak peek as to why you think that. You guys take care.